go ahead and get a couple of things out of the way right up front here. First thing we're going to mention just this first time. The second thing we're going to talk about every single video we do. It's very simple. Number one, I will not be talking about gameplay with one exception. Not really something I feel needs to be discussed or referenced, and to be honest, everything I really have to say about the gameplay I already said back in the series video that went live just earlier today. Not really not a lot to add to that. Not until a certain point in time. So, second warning, we'll be saying this every single video, so do take heed. Just in the off chance you're watching this and do not want spoilers, you're going to be disappointed, because this entire video will be completely spoilerific in every way, shape, and form. We'll be discussing everything with regards to the entire series, as I understand it thus far, admittedly not having played all the way through Portable Ops or Peace Walker. So keep that in mind. So in other words, there will be no, spoilers thing. So, alright, now that we've gotten that out of the way, this is such a weird game to comment on. One of the things that Metal Gear Solid does, interestingly, is it's a pretty well done, what I like to call the one-step story. In other words, it is one step away from real life. Just one. You know, it's obviously not, it's designed in a way to make it look like it could be happening in everyday, normal, real-world life, right? And it's obviously designed to be done so. You know, all the discussions about history and whatnot are all fairly analogous to what actually happened in history. Most of the way the government works and the structure and the technology is all pretty consistent, but then there's that one step. Now, don't mistake one step for meaning there's only one difference. That's actually a different kind of thing. That's usually an alternate reality type thing. The one step is anything that is changed about this reality from ours is only one step different. Obviously, by the time we get to 4, that's a little bit different because that actually hits science fiction territory. But for Metal Gear Solid 1, and to a large degree Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3, it's only one step away. You know, you've got these nanomachines which are capable of doing things that are kind of silly. Gene therapy, which doesn't actually work that way, the way they describe in the games. The vaguely mystical, pseudo-fantasy style stuff, I'll be talking about that more a little bit later. All that kind of a thing, right? It's all just one step off, so you could see this kind of stuff happening in real life. It's an interesting approach to storytelling design. The intent here, at least I am imagining, but usually when it is done in this way, is to make it feel more personable, to involve you, the player, more in it, so that you can care more about the result, rather than having it be a total fiction or a total fantasy or what have you. Whether it succeeds or not is, of course, up to you. Now, let's talk about one other thing, and this has been a hallmark of the series pretty much since Metal Gear Solid. Make of this what you will. I can't actually do this properly, but I have these tendencies to talk in a very unusual fashion! With lots of odd pauses in their conversation. If you actually analyze the speech patterns and the sentence structure, it is genuinely unusual. It's its own thing, and most of the time, it only... I'm not going to say it doesn't make sense, because you can always get the meaning from it. It's more like it just seems off, perhaps in keeping with my one-step theory. Like, people don't actually talk that way. And, it's very strange, the way it's presented, and this is true throughout the whole series, but that really got its start here. I noticed it a little bit more in the remake than in the original version, obviously, I suppose, but I don't know, it's one of those things that I have always tolerated about the Metal Gear Solid series, rather than embraced. But that being said, there was one thing I do actually like about the Metal Gear Solid series as a whole, and that's that it takes its particular tropes, cliches, whatever you want to call them, and just kind of runs with them. It is completely unashamed of itself. And while, I already talked about the squick factor, which basically doesn't even come in Metal Gear Solid 1, the concept of the... I don't even know what to call it. Metal Gear Solid's own particular kitsch, its own little flavor that it presents, it does so open-facedly. There's this genuine degree of enthusiasm in the way it approaches itself. And I think that's one of the reasons why, even after all this time, and the shall we say, unusual writing style and voice acting style of the games, I still do enjoy the story, the cutscenes, the characters, etc. So take it for what it's worth. But I mention this here specifically, and, you know, this is a rumination. I'm supposed to talk about stuff, right? I feel like this was done deliberately to give it its own feel and style. I could be reading too much into this, but given the way that this has been perpetuated throughout the series, it wouldn't surprise me if the original intent was to make this not quite a spy feel, you know, not quite a feel of a spy movie, not quite a feel of an action movie, not quite a feel of a, or video game, however you want to define it, not quite the feel of a, you know, Bond movie, but some kind of its own unique mix of all three. And the idea of trying to present something that is as simultaneously fairly realistic looking and completely unrealistic. It's got its own little uncanny valley thing going in all the things that I've mentioned before. But again, I feel like that it was done on purpose. I also want to mention really briefly here, the game's multiple writers are interesting. I'm going to mention this later especially, but most of the scenes you can actually feel or tell the difference in the writing style between who's talking and how they're talking and what they're saying and why they're saying it, kind of a thing. Most notably, a lot of the codec conversations feel like they were written by a completely separate staff than most of the cutscene writers. That could be more down to the voice directing. I could be reading too much into that. But it's indicative of how many people tend to be involved in influencing a work, and their different traits and personalities coming throughout that. Speaking of which, I don't really have a good point to mention this, so I'm just going to mention this right now. One of the things I really like about the remake, Twin Snakes, I believe it was called, is that it's a proper remake. Now you might be looking at, well, what, it's just a graphics remake? Well, no, it isn't. First of all, more cutscenes, more dialogue. Second of all, little bit of tweaking in certain things with regard to the engine, and a lot of tweaking in gameplay. They really refined the gameplay and made it, among other things, you know, this is the most famous example, make it so you can do a no-kill playthrough properly. You know, as had become a thing by the time the remake came out. And of course, the graphics were touched up, and let's be honest, look way better. I actually prefer the graphic style of Twin Snakes, aka Metal Gear Solid 3's overall graphic style, personally, but that's just me. The other thing, though, and this deserves its own mention here. For those of you who do not know, all of the dialogue was re-recorded for this game, and David Hayter himself basically paid out of pocket. I don't know the specifics, but you know, he pushed in and made sure that that would actually happen, because there wasn't really the budget for that kind of thing, and that's one of the reasons with doing a proper remake. They are expensive. But I think that was really cool that he did that, and honestly, I think that it really shines through. So you notice there was no assessment, because there's not really a recommendation here, but take this one little nugget. If you are interested in playing Metal Gear Solid 1, pick up Twin Snakes, pick up the remake. It is a proper remake, and it's an awesome version. Moving along. So, let us talk about the Kingdom Hearts aspect of this game. I know, you're looking at me weird. This is true, well, I don't even know if this is true in the other games, because it never really struck me as something memorable, but when I was going through Metal Gear Solid 1 here, one of the things I noticed a lot was the no music thing. For those of you who've seen my Kingdom Hearts videos, or my stream most notably, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The no music, to clarify for those of you who have not, because there's probably a lot of people here who don't give a damn about Kingdom Hearts, the idea here is a scene that should have music that doesn't. And I define it that way because a lack of music should be used as a tool to emphasize or to get across a point or to try and build flavor or ambiance or tension or whatever. When you overuse a lack of music, a game just comes across feeling pleh, as I like to put it. And I've actually asked a fairly large variety of people, PC gamers, console gamers, people who aren't gamers, you know, people who only play a game once in a while, people who are like me and play tons and tons of games. The consensus pretty universally seems to be in alignment with what I think. In other words, when it's too little music, when they do the no music thing too much, it gets noticeable and bothersome. And I kind of had that problem with Metal Gear Solid, especially during a lot of the cutscenes. It's almost a bit of a shame because they do something really cool with music later. I'll mention that. Don't worry, I got my notes. But I just thought I'd point it out because it's not something I remember as being a huge thing. I remember the awkward voice acting and the lines that just kind of jilt around and don't really make sense when you really say them out loud. Metal Gear Solid 3 especially has a few scenes that I remember and just kind of... But anyways, let's go ahead and talk about another thing that Metal Gear Solid really did, and that is it started two trends. Now, I'm going to talk about these two things. They seem unrelated, but bear with me. The idea of a global conflict and the idea of geopolitical status and altercation on a national or a global level is something that's actually kind of a big deal behind the Metal Gear series in as a whole. Even in the original Metal Gear, but especially throughout the Solid series, the events of the game do change the way the world works, usually for the worse, actually, right up until the climax there in 4. So a lot is happening, a lot has changed. You are effectively changing the world. They talk about saving the world, but you get my point. A lot of this stuff is going down. But one of the interesting things they do is they use a method, I should really put this in proper context, a method to really bring that home. Because they assumed, correctly, as most writers and designers will, that if you just say, well, we're doing this to save the world, or this is how it's affecting the world, all these themes that go through Metal Gear Solid 1 affect a lot of people, but if you just present a mass or a statistic or a label, people have a much harder time feeling that. So instead we get something that, again, became a staple of the series. Iconic, fleshed out villains. Each one having their own little thing, each having, I'd say it's almost kind of anime style, but then again, anime does the same thing for basically the same reason, or at least it used to. Each villain has their own name, their own scenes, their own personalities. They get fleshed out. They have a fairly long death sequence, which usually has some significance for character development, both for themselves and whoever the protagonist is. Really fleshing out these characters, specifically so you can get a better image of what exactly all these themes and all this world-affecting events have on an individual level. Seeing that person and how these events have affected them, and how they feel about it, and how they're moving through it, good, bad, in between, really helps flesh out that overall picture. They do a great job of it. Of course, again, this kind of became a staple, and I feel like maybe they took it a little bit too far, especially in 4, but again, we'll talk about that later. But then the other thing that became a staple of Metal Gear Solid series is the twist. Don't look at me like that. You know what I'm talking about. The Metal Gear Solid series has always had a really strong emphasis on the twist. That being said, I feel like pretty much all the twists in the 4 games we're looking at were actually pretty well done. But I do specifically call them twists, not reveals. Because a twist is something you're not supposed to expect. It's supposed to be everything you know is wrong, as opposed to a reveal, which is, here's more information, and now all this stuff makes sense. Don't mistake, the series does do reveals in addition to twists, but there's usually one or several large twists within the series that are noteworthy. Of course, you could say the entire plan to arm Rex was the twist in 1, but in hindsight, and this is funny because I kind of forgot this too, in hindsight the big twist is actually the truth about Liquid and Solid, and there's nature, and of course then there's the twist about Fox Die, which is also a pretty big twist, but not as big. The Snake and Liquid thing is actually the big reveal there. And of course, well, there were several twists, but the Miller thing, all that sort of thing. Now, they did it pretty well, but it's worth noting, again, you have to think of the context. I don't know how many of you were actively gamers when Metal Gear Solid 1 first came out on the PlayStation 1, but one of the things that I couldn't get away from it, people were constantly talking about how incredibly smart and complicated the plot was because of the big twist about Rex. That big twist, you activating Rex because you had to deactivate. By the way, as a side note, re-watching through it, there are a couple times when there are hints about that, so props to them. Basically, the idea is that every now and again, obviously they fed misinformation to them, both through the codec and through the having conversations, that kind of a thing. But there were a couple times where they slipped up, and it shows that they, might have screwed up, and I think that was basically done for the player's sake, but good job on that. Anyways, everyone was talking about this amazing twist and how awesome it was that it worked that way and blah, 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 blah. And of course the fact that that was, Frank Yeager, and the fact that she was his sister, and by the way, Meryl is actually, I don't know if they mentioned on this one. You get the point. Now, it was done pretty well in Metal Gear Solid. Don't mistake me, this is not me complaining. But it is worth noting that, especially speaking personally and as a writer, it is much easier to keep a plot smart and self-sense making, the kind of thing where everything fits together, rather than you going, well, wait, that doesn't make any sense, when you're doing it within one work. What then happened is Metal Gear Solid 2 came out and had its own twists, and then 3 came out and had its own twists, and then 4 came out and had 700,362.5 twists. And after a certain point in time, not only do you kind of expect the twist, which takes away from it, but it gets to the point where it's going to be much, much easier for plot holes to stick through. And there are plot holes in the series, let's be honest. But I'm going to go ahead and give praise to the writing staff and the writing crew that went into this, because there aren't that many plot holes. Considering how stupidly complicated the quadrilogy story is, the fact that there are as few plot holes as there are is a testament to their incredible writing job of tying everything up. So, yeah, that's actually really awesome, and I just wanted to prompt that. Regardless, though, it does turn some people off. I know a fair number of people myself who liked Metal Gear Solid 1 and its smart plot, and then they got into 2, and then they stopped playing the series, and have never tried 3 or 4 because of that, because 2 kind of took that to the next level, you know? But we're talking about 1 here, and so credit where credit is due. They certainly got me back in the day. The activating Rex was awesome. Let's see. One other thing that's interesting is the existence of the mystical / supernatural in the series. Again, one step away, right? But mostly in this one, it was actually really toned down. There were really only 2, maybe 3 examples as you're going through it. The wolf thing with Sniper Wolf, I'm talking specifically of the wolves and the way they treated her like she was a part of her pack, a part of their pack, excuse me, that kind of a thing. Vulcan Raven is the obvious one. His predictions of the future, and of course his raven that came out of his forehead kind of a thing. And of course, the really obvious one, which is Psycho Mantis, the telekineticist. All of these things, again, only one step removed. It's not someone, you know, making giant guns that shoot knives come out of thin air because they pulled it out of a purse or whatever, you know. Magic of Monica reference there. The point being, it's fairly believable and fairly contained, but that will also become something that's kind of a hallmark of the series, and we'll be talking about that a lot more when we get to 3 and most especially 4. But in this game, nothing about it bothered me. Quite the contrary. I feel like the tiny little touch, it was like seasoning. You've got this soup of this military and these trained officials and all these things, and then you add just a little bit of seasoning, and the seasoning pulls them from being highly trained professional, you know, warriors or soldiers or whatever, and takes them one step up from that, so that instead of being merely a good dish, it is now a great dish, and it really helped flesh out the characters. In all honesty, of the Goon Squad, for lack of a better term, in 1, 2, 3, and 4, the ones in 1 are the ones that are most memorable to me. Most notably Wolf and Mantis, although Vulcan gets his own props. I'm not actually counting Ocelot in that, by the way. And I suppose Decoy Octopus, well, I wish I could remember him more, but I mean, by design, we basically never really get to interact with him. I mean, other than when he was pretending to be Donald, aka Sigint. Spoilers! Anyways. But my point here is it really helped flesh out the characters, which I'll be talking about individually, don't worry. Hopefully I don't miss any this time like I did with KOTOR. Now, I guess we're actually... hang on, we got another tab here. I got one last point here. As I was going through the ending, I was very bored. Don't mistake me, because I'm the kind of person who tends to like a nice, good, you know, chunk ending. FF4, Return of the King. You know, I like great endings, but I don't know why, but in this ending it was just repetitious, I think, if I'm going to be honest with myself. The theme of moving on with your life, yeah, okay, I get that, but then they kept hammering it in and hammering it in. And after a while, I just kind of got tired of it. I actually got up, wandered off, started prepping the room for recording, you know, got my notes ready, got my outfit all set to go, and I'm just, as the ending is playing, I'm just like, is it done yet? A little bit over the top, which is unusual, since certain other games' endings, I think, were done a lot better. 3 and 4 both had phenomenal endings. I'm not sure what's up with that. I'm kind of glad they got away from that. Alright, let's talk about characters. We're going to talk about Liquid Snake first, because I have the least to say about him. Now, when you ask me to think about the great characters of this Metal Gear Solid series, I tend to think of Ocelot. I tend to think of, John. I tend to think of David. I tend to think of, I guess I could call him Adam or Adamska if you prefer. I think of all these great characters, and I'm like, yeah. And then nowhere on that list is Liquid, because he's not a great character. I'm sorry, no offense to the writers or the actor. It's just he comes across as a child constantly, and I honestly find myself wondering if that was deliberate or not, which is where I'm going to analyze a little bit here. See, we have in Liquid someone who is constantly trying to prove himself and push himself and be better than he perceived himself to be, a sort of well, all of these individuals that I'm going to be going through exhibit certain signs of I guess we'll call it mental instability, to be nice. And his is very definitely a form of self-loathing, fixation, self-obsession kind of a thing going on, right? But he is so constantly overcompensating for his own feelings of inferiority that it actually gets kind of grating. And the only scene where I could tolerate him is his big scene, the one at the end where he does the info dump and, the twist to Solid, which was actually a pretty decent scene, all things considered. But the whole time as he's talking, oh my god, man. Now but again, I wonder, was that actually the way he presented himself, or was that the way he discovered it would be beneficial to present himself so that those around him would perceive him as a non-threat, a non-issue? We do see through action that Liquid is really good in combat. They do a pretty good job of trying to make him the equal of the player character and overall prowess. And his, everyone in the Metal Gear Solid series has some kind of superpower or another. The only exceptions being Big Boss and Snake, whose superpowers are basically being incredibly awesome. Liquid's superpower is that he basically can't die. He survives so much, and after surviving all that, it is only because he is so weakened by all that that Foxdie finally actually kills him. But when you have that kind of ability, you can push yourself a lot harder than you otherwise would, which also leads me to my second theory, which is maybe he has this childish demeanor because he doesn't know what the meaning of consequences are. And honestly, I think this is actually more likely, and the one I would actually put my stamp down is how I feel Liquid actually is. Someone who does not think about... He is not an adult, right? But he is literally not an adult in the sense that he does not think about the results and consequences and taking ownership of his own actions, which is what I usually define as being an adult, regardless of your age. And so everything he does, his violence, his war, his attempt to do this insurrection... the entire thing with the nuke, single thing he does not actually considering what he's going to be doing, not just to himself and his crew, but to the world. And he keeps portraying himself like, oh, I know exactly what's going to happen. No, you don't know anything, you moron. And that's kind of my point. He does things without regard. He's like Voyager. I'm sorry, that was a low blow. But you get my point, right? I think that's the reality of Liquid's character. He never actually considers what next, or where is this going to lead. He's always in the moment. You could argue that that's the mentality a soldier should have, and we'll be talking about that later because that's one of the major themes of Metal Gear Solid 1 and the series as a whole. But regardless, not really what I would call leader material. One final note about Liquid before I move on. He is definitely a soldier, not an officer. Not a leader, not a ruler, a soldier. Just thought I'd share that thought there. Let's go ahead and talk about Vulcan Raven. Now, I have very little to talk about him, to be completely honest with you. In hindsight, and I can't believe I'm saying this, most of the characterization I remembered from him actually came from the comic. Well, which comic, Arsha Gaia? I hear you say. It's called The Last Days of Foxhound. It's a webcomic. It's available online. Art's kind of crap. The story's amazing. I highly recommend you pick it up and read it. It's 500 issues long, really short for a webcomic. It's done now, too. It finishes right at the end of Metal Gear Solid 1. Obviously given the name, The Last Days of Foxhound. But I do honestly recommend it because early on it's, light comedy. Hey, it's silly and stupid stuff. And then it gets a little more serious, and then it gets super serious, and then it gets awesome. Well, actually, it's kind of awesome throughout this whole arc. But honestly, they flesh out so many of the characters so much more there. No one more than Raven, though. Because what was his characterization in the actual game? Now, he does have some, but I have so little to analyze here. He is a Klingon. I don't mean this as a derogatory, but that is basically his personality. He is a typical Klingon type character. He's got a warrior's code and the mentality of proving himself through strength and through combat. He likes genuinely likes the idea of a combative life, and you get the impression that he is one of the few who truly believes in the idea of the eternal war cycle that Liquid is trying to start with his insurrection, because that's the ideal kind of place for him. And even when he dies, unlike some of the characters, there's no... I mean, obviously he is at peace with his death, but he's not actually at peace. It's more like he accepts it, because that's how life works. You kill or be killed, and once you're killed, it's over. Very pragmatic, almost, I think I would call it. But I just don't have much else to say about him. I'm sorry. The fact that... oh, by the way, his superpower is the fact that he can lift a total number of weight that arguably would weigh more than a car would. I'm not even kidding. Look it up. Look up that Vulcan. Look up that barrel he's got on. He can carry that around. Wow! So yeah, his incredible strength and endurance is how he is his superpower. Let's go ahead and move on to... who do we want to do next? Let's go ahead and talk about Frank Jaeger, a.k.a. the Cyborg Ninja. Now, Mr. Cyborg Ninja was kind of a funny character because most people playing this game had no idea who Frank Jaeger was. Now, they reference him in the game. They say, you know, oh my god, you killed him in Zanzibar, and they even describe the fight. But they have to do that because most people who played Metal Gear Solid, you know, percentage-wise, didn't actually play Metal Gear or Metal Gear 2. So they had no idea who this guy was. Now, I did, admittedly, because I played those games on the NES. But, you know, I get to this thing, it's like, oh my god, it's Frank Jaeger. I actually recognized him. I recognized the name, I should say. You know, or rather, I recognized the Gray Fox, because that's how they reference him. And it's like, wow. And, it was certainly interesting to see the way they took him, because it made sense, given the fact that we kind of killed him pretty decisively last time. We'll see what lengths they go to make characters come back later on in the series. Moving on. But his character was interesting because he portrays... You don't actually find out a decent amount of this in this game. But as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about everything in concept here. He is incredibly damaged when it comes to his mindset, his emotions, his psychology, his ability to function as a living being. I would argue that it is debatable if he is even considered truly a human. I don't mean he's not sentient. I mean he is not a complete person, if you know what I mean. And that's not really a surprise because, well, you know, I've talked about, you know, my military history, background, friends, family in the past. Let's just say that one of the things that is fairly consistent in the military is if you survive it, you don't come out the same that you went in, and usually it's in a bad way. Now, our good friend Frank here was kind of an extreme example of that, but holy God, I could actually see that kind of thing happening to someone minus the cyborg implants and whatnot, given his backstory, given what he went through, given the thing. It's actually kind of funny if you pay attention during Captain America: The Winter Soldier. What they did with the Winter Soldier, the titular character, is actually pretty similar, in all honesty, to what Frank was going through in the Metal Gear series. But he is also he brings up two thoughts for me. One, he is pretty much the poster child for the ultimate dichotomy in soldier and human. I put these both in quotes because the point is there's this line between these two, and I'll be talking about this more when we get to the themes, but here's a great time to discuss this in brief. What is an ideal soldier is not going to be a good human, and a good human is not going to be an ideal soldier, right? Obviously these are relative terms, hence the quotes, but the point is Frank was leaning so hard into the soldier thing that it makes you wonder if there was anything left in him that was human. Arguably the only thing he did that was actually human was Naomi. You know, everything else was all about him being a perfect soldier, the perfect soldier. Null, they called him. So appropriate, because that's what, you know what, I'll talk about that subject later, but we'll shelve that for now. But my point is, Frank is the personification of that concept, of that idea, that politicians and the people in control don't want people, they want soldiers. The other thing I want to mention is the idea that if he had lived through this experience, do you think he could have ever recovered? Ever. Emotionally, mentally. I'm not talking physically. There's medical technology, especially in the Metal Gear series, is kind of through the roof. That's not what I'm talking about. Do you think he could have ever been a person again? I didn't. You notice I didn't say a normal person, just a functional person, a stable person, a person who could live rather than merely exist. I'm not sure he could. After all he'd been through, after everything that had been dragged through him, before Dr. Clark got a hold of him, and then she got her talons into him. Yeah, the stuff she did. You ever wonder if Paramedic is actually evil? Pay attention to the stuff she did to him, and holy God. Ugh, very amoral look at things. But the point is, it's an interesting question because that's actually something that is faced in real life. There's a reason why that people do tours in the military here in the States. There's a reason why some people, when they get back, they have mandatory psychiatrists and psychologists, you know, dealing with them and working with them. There's a reason why therapy is such a commonality for people who are vets. It's because we're trying to help these people become people again, or to re-grasp being people, or to continue being people. But we don't ever know if we actually can on a case-to-case basis. Now, obviously, with someone like, you know, Frank, he went way over the edge, and to be totally blunt, I don't think he ever was going to be able to be a person again. But the question I leave you with, and I'm not going to give you my answer because that's not the point. The point of the question is, should we try? Should we try and help people who have gone through that much damaged history heal? Even if it seems implausible. Speaking of which, let's talk about Sniper Wolf, because she is a very interesting type of character in her general... she is another example of fixation, obsession. Oh, by the way, the ninja's superpowers are kind of obvious. Incredible speed and reflexes, incredible strength, incredible durability. Moving on. Wolf has this great deal of fixation in her things, which actually kind of makes sense for a sniper. It is debatable what her superpower is. We'll get this out of the way right off the bat. Obviously, she's on tranq pills pretty much all the time, so she doesn't actually need to sleep or anything like that, and she keeps in kind of a steady, you know, pseudo-stasis, physically and whatnot, chemically. But she is a stupidly good shot with her sniper rifle. The fact that she could shoot someone in a blizzard with near-perfect accuracy is insane. And it's funny because Ocelot has a pretty similar superpower as well. But the point is, she is a damn good shot with that thing. And she also has the ability to endure, both in terms of patience and environment, pretty well past what other people should be able to. Her patience, her extreme patience, allows her to really focus in on things, and it is debatable as to whether or not that is part of why she acts the way she does, where she fixates on something to the point where she absolutely cannot get past thinking about whatever her given target is, because all her thought is bent on it. You know, Sauron kind of a thing here. The other reason I bring that up, though, is that it strikes me as the thought that she is doing this as a coping mechanism. I mean, Lord knows she did not exactly have a good childhood. And more than any of the others, with the possible exception of Mr. Mantis, she is definitely a victim. Everything that she went through as a child, everything that she went through growing up, everything she had to endure. As she puts it, forgive me for the paraphrase, I had to watch the disgusting nature of humanity through the scope of my sniper rifle. And it makes me wonder how many things she's seen while she waits patiently for a target to actually get into her view, you know? And that kind of thing will warp a person and twist them, especially when they grew up the way she did. And finding meaning. I know that sounds cliched, but it's true. Finding meaning is something human beings like to do in general. Go figure, right? A purpose behind it, a reason behind it. It wasn't all for nothing. All this death and horribleness didn't actually happen for no reason. There was a point to it, and in her case, I feel like that desire to make there be a point in everything is why she fixates so hard and obsesses so hard over a given target, so that when it's done, she can just flush all those thoughts and emotions away and not have to deal with them, even though they're at the back of her mind, kind of clawing at her brain there. As most expertly put, when she herself said that she was not looking and waiting to kill, she was waiting for someone to kill her. Psycho Mantis. His superpowers are the most obvious of all. He's a telekineticist. and a telepathic. He is telepathic and telekinetic. And, the end. Arguably the strongest one ever in the entire series. I say arguably because it is debatable. Psycho Mantis is very interesting. I would be remiss if I did not mention his fourth wall breaking shenanigans. You might be interested to know that they actually made new ones for the GameCube version. What would detect if you played like Mario Sunshine or Eternal Darkness, stuff like that, instead of the Konami games on the original PlayStation 1. But the fact that they did it in both is actually pretty cool. And recorded, separate sound files for them. And then, of course, he makes your controller shake, because of course he does. There's a couple other moments where that happens in the game, too, actually. The torture sequence comes to mind. And for those of you who don't know, in the GameCube version, you actually can't just put it from player 1 to player 2. You have to go all the way over to player 4, or all the way each one over to 4. I'm not sure. I did each one, just to find out which one it was, in order to actually be able to play. It's beautifully meta in its own way, because it's done straight-facedly. At no point in time does he say, you have to unplug the controller or anything like that, or you have to do this. It was never like you, the player, have to do it. They were acting as if that was how it was actually working, which is an unusual way to do meta. In other words, straight-faced meta. The idea of we're not actually breaking character, we're just referencing things that we shouldn't be able to know about, as if we do. That being said, I got a comment. There was one little scene in the GameCube version, I don't even remember if this is in the original PlayStation, which just made me raise an eyebrow. Psycho Mantis is hovering there, and he says, "Place your controller as flat as you can on the ground." And the camera does this swivel pan to Snake, who immediately turns the camera. Oh, I'm sorry, turns the camera just like this and gives you a quick nod, and then he looks back at him, like he's telling you it's okay. Put the controller down. That kind of made me roll my eyes a bit, but I imagine they did that because otherwise you might not realize they mean literally. And of course, Psycho Mantis is probably one of the earlier and most well-known examples of interface screw, aka the concept of actually changing the way the game presents itself to you in order to get across the fact that something is wrong here with a given boss, area, dungeon, etc. But now that we've got that out of the way, let's actually talk about Psycho Mantis as a character. He strikes me as someone who, in a similar vein to what has been explored sometimes before in fiction, views his ability to read other people's thoughts as a curse rather than a blessing, and does not like having to hear their thoughts and feel, and over time, especially as a child, grew to think of other people's thoughts as poisoned and unpleasant and otherwise horrible. The fact that his own father hated him and wanted to kill him, for example, well, of course that's through his own thoughts in the mind of a child, but it's very possible, is a pretty good example of the fact that he probably has had a warped view since the beginning. And having to continually endure that over the ages, especially during the Cold War, which is when he was growing up as a child, there's a lot of unpleasantness you could scan from people's brains while you're doing that. And so I feel like his fixation on the main element that really bothered him, which is procreation, was his own way of coping with that. Again, a way to try and explain things, give a purpose behind it. All these people do horrible things are all doing it just to be genetically violent and genetically pass on their genes. It's all a competition. It's all, everyone for himself. An almost severely extreme Darwinism style of mentality. But then again, the other thing that could be mentioned here is maybe he was just so miserable all the time because of everything he encountered that the only thing he could really feel himself to do, and he says it himself, is I want to kill as many people as possible. Honestly, it reminds me a little bit of Kafka in some ways, because I feel like he had a gap, a hole in his mentality and his emotion, in his ability to function as a human being, and he tried to fill that with something he was good at, killing. And right at the end, when he actually helps them, he has an interesting line. He says, I don't think I've ever used my powers to help someone before. It feels nostalgic. That line made me wonder quite a bit, actually. I'm not even sure if he phrased it that way in the original PlayStation version, but in the GameCube it was written that way, and it feels nostalgic. And I found myself wondering if maybe he was talking about the idea that maybe he was a good person once upon a time and actually desired to help people, and he has since forgotten that because of how much and how hard he has examined the lives and minds of psychopaths and killers. Or maybe what he's actually saying is that he doesn't fully believe his own theory about everything being competitive and everything being violent, everything against each other, and that the idea is that he is experiencing that feeling from, the bygone ages, or whatever you want to call that, deep within his soul, however you want to phrase that. Just thought, just food for thought. Also, he looks cool. Let's talk about... let's talk about Hal. Hal Jordan. No, I'm kidding. Otacon. Okay. There's no easy way to put this. He is portrayed as a complete loser in his introduction scene. And honestly, it was so over the top that it actually made me kind of groan when I was going through it. Oh my god, it's just like in the animes. Except he says Japanimation. And his whole thing about, oh, are you an otaku too? No. Then again, he is ludicrously naive, but we'll talk about that in a second. That being said, Hal is an interesting character because he portrays... I honestly feel he is actually intended to be the viewpoint character for the audience. And I don't mean because he's an otaku and has some, shall we say, social awkwardness issues. No, I genuinely mean that he is someone who is a fairly normal person, relatively speaking. He's not a super soldier or anything like that. He does have a superpower. It's his brain. He is stupidly smart, and this is shown throughout the series, especially 2 and 4. But he, he seems fairly normal. He doesn't know how to deal with this thing. He doesn't know how to deal with the action or the violence or the terrorist attack or the threat to the world, anything like that. Instead, he rises to the occasion. He tries to lift himself up to the point where he doesn't actually embarrass himself that much and actually has a positive impact on everything that happens. And so I feel like that's the point of his character arc, is the idea that he is someone who, unlike Liquid, is someone who is willing to own up and take responsibility for his actions and face the consequences thereof, most notably when he decides to go ahead and stay behind in the base as he's making sure that Snake can get out, even knowing that that will probably end with his death. That being said, Hal is interesting because Hal Emmerich is interesting because he is naive, but I feel like, and this could just be me reading into it, he is deliberately naive. He is the mirrored version of the type of naivete that Snake portrays, that David portrays. He looks at a situation and thinks almost delusionally in an optimistic manner. In fact, he actually does get delusionally optimistic in several things. The idea that he was building this wonderfully, amazingly, ridiculously powerful weapon and is its primary designer and helps it to do this whole thing where it's going to shoot down, missiles and all that fun stuff. That's very much the kind of thing I would expect from him. Someone who is just looking at the pure science and deliberately deceiving himself into thinking that, well, because he wants to make the world a better place with science, all these people giving him all this funding and all these resources and all this time to work on that must agree with him. I mean, that's just logical, right? They wouldn't give him all this money and time if they wanted a weapon. They must think like he does. And when he finally faces the truth of the situation, you can almost hear him saying it as he's, as he's trying to deny it verbally and vocally. He's just, no, you don't understand. It has to be good. Science can be for the betterment of people. And then he explains why, and I'll be getting this more into the theme thing, but his own little family history and how he has always wanted to try and make a positive impact on the nuclear situation in the world, rather than the incredibly negative one that he has actually created. Yeah. Good character, though. I like him. Let's go ahead and make a segue before we talk about Solid, aka David. Let's talk about Meryl. Meryl is interesting because I want to talk about her right next to Otacon, because both of them represent Snake's character growth throughout the piece. Otacon is someone who is deliberately, delusionally, optimistically naive, to the point where mostly about science and about people and you know in general, but he does so and is willing to own up and say, well, no, you know, things aren't that great, but I'm going to do the best I can to make things better. Meryl similarly has her own naivete, but hers is more a matter of innocence and ignorance rather than actual naivete. See, and the word ignorant is thrown around as an insult a lot. I usually don't use it as an insult. I use it as a literal term. You lack knowledge. Meryl, very green, having no idea what war is actually like or has been like, lacks knowledge. And so she retains that innocence on the matter and not actually realizing what kind of a person Solid is, or having any real idea of what warfare is actually like. Her own descriptions of how she felt when she was preparing to shoot someone, or the smell of blood on her clothing, all of those things are actually taken from real life accounts of people who have first entered combat and basically couldn't handle it. Again, going back to that whole concept of the soldiers and the dehumanization, which I'll be talking about later. I'll talk about that later, but the idea here is between Hal and between Meryl, Snake sees two different perspectives on his own mindset. Obviously, he grows to care about Meryl. Whether or not there's romantic overtones or not is debatable. They're really overt with it, so I think the original intent was there to definitely be a romance there, even though by 4 that's just kind of gone out the window. But I think the important point, if I'm being blunt, is not that she's female, and not that there is a romance there. She is someone that he grows to care about. She is someone who looks up to him and respects him with a degree of near absolute innocence. Even while he says openly and bluntly how terrible of a person he is, she continues to be devoted to him. And that maintenance of that persistence is, I think, what actually cracks his facade and really starts to allow him to start being David rather than Solid. And between her and Hal, who represents the other side of another side, not the other side, another side of things, the idea of owning up to your own actions and honestly trying to do better and to better the world by your actions, I think is what gave him the motivation to actually finally break out of his own shell of being a soldier and reveal the human that was still underneath, making him debatably the only character that actually was human in this entire piece. From the beginning, and actually managed to express that by the end, which I think is actually really awesome. Now, let's go ahead and segue into our good friend Snake, because I was just talking about him. Solid Snake, aka David Hayter, I think. Kidding. First of all, I just wanted to comment on something really quick. I feel like he had 3 writers. There's the one writer, and I can describe the one writer pretty simply. Hang on, I need book of some kind here. I've got my calendar right here, which I do to keep my schedule straight. So, October 25th, this will happen, and it will, okay, hang on. On October 6th, it will be Labor Day in Australia. And then Snake would say, Labor Day in Australia? Yes, and on October 13th, it will be Columbus Day. Columbus Day on October 13th? You know what I'm talking about. Metal Gear! I feel like there's that writer where he literally, I call it the sounding board. He basically only says something every now and again to remind the audience that he's there or to prompt another tidbit of information. I know that's, again, referring to the style thing I mentioned earlier. That's part of the kitsch, and that's kind of the thing for the Metal Gear Solid series. But I gotta be honest, at least in this game, we'll see how it is through the future games, but at least in this game, it actually got kind of old, and I was like, okay, yeah, I get it. Then he's got his second writer, and I'm just going to call this military consultant, because a lot of what he said actually sounds like it's coming straight out of a military handbook. His discussions on protocol, how you're supposed to handle yourself, medically, emotionally, psychologically, the way you're supposed to use a gun, a lot of the information about that kind of thing. It seemed very professional. The third writer was what I like to call the philosopher writer. He is the one who writes all his lines where he's talking about humanization, the perspectives on how things should go, his own self-doubt, that kind of thing. Arguably the true writer, because of the military jargon is just military jargon, and the other thing is just an echo. This is actually, I feel, the closest thing to a character that Solid actually gets, and one of the things you see a lot in him is a great deal of self-delusion. And the perspective of being... Well, see, it's funny because I actually call him naive too, but a different kind than what Otacon had. Otacon deliberately was optimistic and felt like everything could be used for the betterment of everything. By contrast, Snake was trying to portray himself as everything was black and white. And that's funny because you're like, well, no, he doesn't. He talks constantly about how it's gray and on the battlefield, you can never tell friend or foe. That's not what I mean. He looks at the situation like he is the lone soldier, and always will be, and getting involved in other people's lives is not for him, because that's what humans do, that's what people do, and the idea that you always have to have this certain mentality of the totally amoral and arguably immoral mercenary in order to actually get the job done. The cold, he deludes himself because he is naive enough to think that being the ideal soldier, like Gray Fox was, is a good thing. And yet, as I mentioned, he is human underneath all that. And there's cracks pretty early on, too. You start to see him. It's just a little snippet here or there. But it's most obvious, I feel, when he counteracts that. When he shows so harshly his soldier mentality instead of his humanity as a defense mechanism, as a way to conceal the way he actually feels and the way he actually thinks. So instead of seeing the human, the soldier takes over to portray, no, there's nothing here, and this is how this thing, and I'll shoot you myself if you get in my way. All that kind of a thing. Interesting portrayal overall. I actually, I've got a couple more characters to talk about. We'll talk about Ocelot next. I'm going to go ahead and be blunt. Ocelot's my favorite character in the entire series, by a huge margin. I've actually gone on record as saying that Ocelot is actually the main character, or I'm sorry, the protagonist, the main protagonist of the series, and I still think that's true. But the reason why is mostly because he's the one who actually tends to get things done and was basically playing everyone towards his own particular goals. Again, we'll be talking about this more later. The entire time, and was really, really good at it. But even in the first game, just confining ourselves to the first game, a couple of interesting thoughts about Ocelot. First of all, I have this note here. I'm just going to read word for word. Even an interesting character is messed up. His whole predilection for torture and his sadism, which is funny because it's basically not played up at all later on. It's just him being weird. I think they were trying for a personality trait to affix to him. Oh, right, superpower. Ocelot's superpowers is, first of all, he is stupidly good with his revolvers, and he is stupidly good at aiming them, including, reflective angles with them. And he does have another superpower, which I think is just a little bit presented in this one, although it more comes out in the later ones. He is the ultimate infiltrator. In the last days of Foxhound, the comic, they actually make a point that he is actually immune to psychic probing because his mind is so powerful, so organized, so well compartmentalized that he can even lie to his own brain to the point where, psychic powers don't work on him. And honestly, I totally agree with that, especially given the way that things went in 4. So yeah, that's his other superpower. But moving on. He is... 3 interesting points about him, just in the first game. First of all, he is, in many ways, the good example of an actual infiltrator. See, the thing is, there's a lot of terms that kind of tend to mean the same things, and so you have to kind of define them. Someone like Solid Snake isn't actually an infiltrator in the strictest sense of the word. He isn't a spy in the strictest sense of the word. He is someone who is basically a special ops force. He goes in with intent towards violence, usually towards destructing, killing, or reclaiming, or rescuing, right? He moves in and has a great deal of combat expertise, a great deal of combat capacity, a great deal of combat knowledge with different weapons and all that sort of stuff, and then he uses that to accomplish his mission, right? Then we have someone like an agent. Star Wars, The Old Republic actually probably has the best example of that with the agent class. Someone who is also combat ready, but is more inclined towards technological edge and basically never actually getting caught in order to accomplish their goals. Then we have what is effectively a spy. And that's really what Ocelot is. He is a full-on infiltrator. He joins you And he's right there, and you know he's there, and he's not hidden. He's not, trying to attack you, but everything he's doing is either undermining you or working towards whatever ends he's working towards, while at the same time maintaining his mole status. And he is amazingly good at it. And that's true even in this game, as we note, most especially thanks to that conversation right at the end where he's talking to our good friend Solidus. Which, by the way, just to get this out of the way, Solidus is Latin for solid. It is it refers to the type of coins that they used to pay soldiers in, which is where the word soldier comes from. It's not a blend between liquid and solid, and blah, 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 blah. Moving on. So, the other thing I want to talk about with Ocelot is an interesting little factoid. He is the only survivor amongst the villains group in this game. All of the other ones died a fox die, or, well, actually pretty much all of them died a fox die. But, regardless, they all die and/or are killed throughout the course of the thing. And it's worth noting that even early on, you realize that they had some kind of plan for Ocelot in the future because of the fact that he lived. By that simple fact, he is unique. But the other interesting thing is, why did he live? It gets you thinking, doesn't it? I remember back in the day before 2 came out, wondering why Ocelot was the one to survive. Because he could have had someone on the inside. He could have been working for the Pentagon. But at the same time, I don't think he was, because after all, he directly reported to the President. And we knew this even back in Metal Gear Solid 1, without any of the rest of the franchise coming out yet. And so the idea was always there that he knew things that everyone else didn't, and he was working on for his own ends, even though everyone else was not aware of that. And it throws into question a lot of things. The killing of Donald Anderson is a great example of that, and was almost assuredly done on purpose, even though that put his side, aka Liquid's side, at risk. It was something that was required by, by Ocelot's own particular perspective, by Adamska's own particular perspective and loyalties. And I also think it's significant because he had his arm chopped off and yet still managed to walk away arguably the least scarred of anyone in this entire encounter. Which is also an interesting thing when you think about it, because if you look at Ocelot's overall history, he is probably the least traumatized of a fairly large number of incredibly traumatized characters. Makes you wonder if that's just luck, or maybe he is just that good with his mind, with that incredible brain of his, to try and be well positioned and to avoid situations like that. Makes you wonder. Last point I want to point out is he is the best example of right here. I'm actually not sure what that word is. He is the best example of a theory I've had, and I can't remember the word that I just wrote there. It's a loyalty thing, right? That's right, the care theory. That's what it is. See, here's the idea. I've often said that the only thing that prevents you from doing a thing is how much you care about whatever it is you care about, right? Now that sounds like a duh, but what most people don't understand what that really means when you get into extremes. One of the things that I've always disliked about infiltration, spy, that kind of a thing, especially in fiction, is I've always felt that people will do something to prove their trustworthiness, and yet every time they do it, I just find myself thinking, well, that doesn't prove anything. Oh, but they just killed 20 billion of their own people. So? Are those 20 billion people worth whatever their goal is? Is destroying that base and destroying those ships worth whatever their final end point is? I'm reminded, huge spoiler alert here, of Jin from the Bleach series. He did a lot of terrible things that he didn't want to do, and that he did not agree with. And yet the entire time he kept doing it because what he cared about mattered enough to him that it outweighed all the terrible things he was doing. That's how that works. This is true in real life, too. The only thing that prevents you from doing anything to accomplish something is how important that accomplishment is to you. In Jin's case, and I'm not going to say what he did, just in case, but in Jin's case, what he did was sufficiently important to him to accommodate doing anything else to accomplish it. Ocelot is the exact same way. Ocelot is basically the poster child of this concept in a nutshell. I'll be talking about this more when we get to 4, but even in 1, you could see that he is willing to do basically whatever is required in order to accomplish his mission. And the other interesting thing about that is he's also a wonderful example of what loyalty can and does mean. In the first game alone, we assume he's loyal to Liquid until we find out he's loyal to the President. But as we learn later, that's not true either. And then we learn that's not true either. But he does have, in all honesty, a very strong sense of loyalty. In fact, it's arguably his most defining trait. And I just want to mention that here in brief because it's fascinating that someone who has built so much of his life around deception, lies, trickery, manipulation, that loyalty is the one thing that truly defines Revolver Ocelot. Let's talk about Rex. I'm only going to talk about this very briefly. Rex is the definitive Metal Gear. In my opinion. Okay, I'll go ahead and add it. In my opinion, Rex is the definitive Metal Gear, and he's always been my favorite. But I'd just like to go ahead and comment on one of the reasons why Rex is the definitive. Under suboptimal circumstances for Rex to fight, an enclosed area with not very much maneuvering room and not that much experience in actually piloting the thing, it still took Rex, it still took Solid, the superhuman, oh my gosh, warrior, Fox, the Gray Fox, the also superhuman, amazing, oh my gosh, warrior, and the help of the designer, who deliberately built a weakness into the thing in order to actually defeat Metal Gear Rex. And didn't actually destroy it, too, as we find out later. Of course, you fight on top of things, that's not surprising. It took all of that to bring this Metal Gear down. And that is why Rex is the definitive Metal Gear. Moving on. Let's talk about Campbell. And you're probably wondering why I'm talking about him last, but I'm going to use him to segue into some of the themes of this game. Campbell is interesting because even, granted you don't know most of this in the first game, but even in his history, he was always more human than soldier. He was always someone who had problems with his superiors, keeping things hidden from him. He was always someone who preferred to be on the up and up, to be honorable and decent, all that fun stuff. And as an officer, he's probably one of the definitive officers of fiction of his particular era. And one of the reasons why is he is very much a human officer, in a similar vein to, forgive me for the comparison, Captain Picard is over on Star Trek. He is definitely a captain, definitely a human, or excuse me, definitely an officer who is a commander, someone who is a good leader, but that is always tempered by his humanity. Campbell constantly gives away the fact that he is unhappy with this mission, and he does not like the situation, and as we learn later, the only reason he put up with it was not because he was being coerced or ordered, or anything like that. It was because, well, okay, he was obviously being coerced, but my point is, Meryl was being held hostage to make him cooperate. Not himself. And that's a very important distinction. He was not told to do this. He was not forced, do this or else we'll kill you. Do this or else we'll take away your career. That's not what convinces him to do something he violently disagrees with. It was the threatening of his daughter that finally convinces him. And I can't quite blame him on that, honestly. But it says a lot about the kind of man he is. And it also says a lot that that's what they felt was necessary to convince him. If you think about that for a moment. But there's a line he says, and this is our segue. We're going to go ahead and just skip right ahead here. It says, Snake asked if Snake could trust Meryl. And Campbell responds with a beautiful line, "More than you can trust me." That line right there says everything about why I refused to join the military. When I was much younger, the United States Army, United States Marines, United States Air Force, and United States Navy all tried to court me, actually came to my house on several occasions in order to get me to join up, and I steadfastly said no. It's funny, too, because Mom sat me down and said, it would be a good career, you could do this, it would be great financially, blah, blah, blah. So she demanded a good reason why I would not join the military. And I'm about to give you that reason. On the field of battle, because I wasn't going to go for officer's track, whoever was my direct superior might be someone I trust. Ideally, would be someone I trust, someone I have built a camaraderie with, just like Campbell and Snake did. But I would ultimately be aware of the fact that the orders they are giving me are not actually coming from them. they might be trying to interpret those orders in the best possible way to benefit me and the other people under their command. But those orders didn't come from them. And they might be under orders to do things in a different way, such as, for example, hiding information from your troops, or manipulating them, or sending them to do terrible things because that's where the politicians are swaying right now. I admittedly have an incredibly cynical view of the military, but that's because I've read history. Forgive me for being blunt. And so the idea that someone 8 steps up could send the order that could send me into a situation that I shouldn't be in or don't want to be in or am unprepared for or am unaware of was something I said no to. I do not have blind loyalty to a flag to accept orders from some nameless dweeb who is only interested in his own career. Thank you very much. And Campbell very much, this is why I wanted to use that segue, Campbell very much agreed with me on that philosophy, and he only, there's a reason he retired, there's a reason he did this whole situation the way he did, there's the reason he was the way he was in 4. This was a man who believed in being straightforward and honest with his troops, because they were his troops, they were his people, and it killed him to do the opposite of that. But this is one of the big themes of Metal Gear Solid. There's actually quite a few, and this is just in Metal Gear Solid 1. I have a whole list here. The theme of deception. The theme of manipulation. We're going to talk about this a bit more in a thing here, but the idea here is the idea of lying and using misinformation and deceiving individuals is simultaneously portrayed as a bad thing and a good one. We do see some lies that actually do good throughout this game. The one that comes to mind immediately is what Snake ends up telling Naomi about Frank, which is basically nothing, in other words, not revealing the truth to her, because he wanted her to be benefited by her memory of him and all that he did, rather than to know the horror of the truth of the situation. And yet at the same time, we see the kind of damage deceptions and manipulations can do. I just mentioned the one from Campbell to Snake. What about the one from, they keep mentioning is the Pentagon. What about the damage from the Pentagon, which as we learn later was basically the Secretary of Defense, Jim Hausman or something like that, voiced by an awesome voice actor from Blizzard fame. He and the Pentagon that was backing him had this whole deal with constantly trying to keep everyone unaware of what was going on, both their own soldiers and then the actual people, and then being willing to kill everyone involved purely to clean up the mess afterwards. So we see those kind of lies and what those kind of deceptions can lead to. We also see the kind of deceptions that eventually lead to the way the world becomes in the Metal Gear series. Most of those revolve around the Patriots, which aren't even mentioned in this game, by the way. I was paying attention, zero reference. But the idea of what Ocelot's been playing at and what the President have been playing at, interesting thought processes there. And of course, the big secret about the area itself, nuclear disposal facility. No, no, this is actually a weapons testing platform. And of course, the dependence of both the military-industrial complex and the military aspect of the government having to be codependent on each other and thus constantly deceiving each other to the point where they were basically going to backstab each other and ended up actually backstabbing each other. It's all over the place. But the point is, the biggest way this theme is represented, both in this game and in the series as a whole, is poor, poor Snake. This will go into the second theme, which I'm going to segue into here in a moment. Snake is a soldier in this game. But the best way to describe what he is he is a pawn. No matter what he does or how he does it, he does nothing but advance other people's plans throughout the course of the game. And to be a little bit blunt, that doesn't really change until all the way towards pretty much the ending of Metal Gear Solid 4. Everything he does in all 3 games is be manipulated. And that theme of manipulation is one of the strongest ones because it's the idea of not looking at people as people. Again, this will segue. It's the idea of looking at people as tools, looking at people as pawns. The way that GW or JD or whichever one it was, the AI treats Jack in Metal Gear Solid 2 is the AI construct flat out admitting that this is the truth of how they see people in general, not just soldiers, but the implication there that they want to look at all people as nothing more than tools and pawns on a board to be categorized and stacked properly, so everything's all neat and tidy. But even in this game, we see that Snake is constantly being pulled around, messed with, and manipulated on all sides, and we see what that kind of damage that can do to him and to the people around him. But that second theme, I'll go ahead and segue into this, is what I like to call the soldier mentality. I referenced this briefly earlier when it came to our good friend the Gray Fox. See, this is true in real life, which is one of the reasons I don't like talking about this. I don't like talking about politics on my show. Real life politics. Unless it's historical. But speaking generalized, not taking everyone into account, not taking exceptions into account, what is wanted when you have a soldier, this is the second reason I didn't join the military, by the way, what you want is a soldier, not a person. You don't want to send, Arsha and Gaia, Zayal, into combat. You want to send soldier 8733562 into combat. That's what you want to send into combat. You want to send a unit that has a value to them. They want to be playing StarCraft, not Myth. And the reason this is so significant is the entirety of what they're doing across most of the series, and this goes all the way into Revengeance, actually, but it is even expressed here, is they want to try and engineer this kind of, effectively, robot. Someone who is honed and trained and doesn't really have a sense of self or control over themselves. Instead, they exist solely to be used like a tool. A weapon does not have the right to think for itself, if you'll forgive me for quoting here. And I gotta be blunt, that's actually really horrifying as a thought to me personally. But, like I said, that's the other reason I didn't join the military in real life, because, oh god, I've seen what that can do to some people. And I get why, too. It's not just for the sake of the politicians, even though that is a big reason. It's also so that people can cope with the kind of things they're forced to do in the military better. But again, Gray Fox is probably the best extreme example of this I've seen, in fact or fiction. Someone who is so much a weapon that there's debatable as if there's a human left underneath that. For those of you who don't know his backstory a little bit, when he was still null, he would actually go out, kill his targets, come back and be put in a sensory deprivation tank with chemicals and electricals going through it, so that he would forget everything except for his training, and when he woken up, he'd go out for the next mission. The perfect soldier. Tell me that doesn't sound horrifying. Tell me you don't feel for that child, because he was still a kid while this was happening. This little kid would go out there and act like a kid and get people to lower their guard so he could murder them. Perfect soldier. And this kind of thing is present, again, I'll be talking about it throughout the series as well, Jack. But look at what happened even in this game, the genome soldiers. Secret experiments and conspiracies that ensured that they could use gene splicing and therapy on individuals to try and make them more into what they consider the ideal soldier, trying to identify the soldier genes, which are ultimately proved to be a fallacy, but I'll talk about that in a bit. And the idea of trying to train them through psychotherapy. There's even tiny little hints of this. The idea that Meryl loses her romantic compunctions because she was mentally trained and programmed to not think in such a manner. What? One of the biggest themes, though, about the entire Metal Gear Solid series is the one I'm talking about right now. The idea, this is really keeping strong with the theme that was brought up in the original Metal Gear. The idea of the soldiers wanting to be soldiers, wanting to, if I can use a different word, to be a warrior, rather than being a tool. There's a difference between a person who has a code of ethics, who has a code of honor, who conducts themselves decently and orderly, who tries to do the best that they can towards the ideals they live for and strive for, and a gun. And that was what Big Boss was always pushing for. And that is what Liquid, in his own juvenile way, was pushing for. And that's what Ocelot wanted. And the idea of being a person rather than and Snake himself goes in this journey where he basically pulls out of his shell of being a soldier and allows himself to be more human by the end, to the point where he actually dislikes the idea of being a murderer and a killer and, well, being like Frank. And that's the final key, and I was going to mention this here anyways, of Solid Snake's character arc that goes throughout the game, Metal Gear Solid 1. Meryl helped him to have someone to care about due to her insistence, her persistence, and her care about him. Hal helped him by showing him idealism, optimism, and that kind of acceptance and of consequence and of action. But then Frank, the Great Fox, shows him exactly what he could turn into if he went too far the other way. Shows him what it would be like to be just a soldier and nothing else. And I don't think he liked what he saw there. I sure as hell didn't. I guess I don't have anything else to talk about this. It's the most powerful theme throughout the whole series. We're people, damn it. But speaking of which, let's go ahead and talk about... God, there's a lot to talk about. Let's talk about genetic destiny. The actual term genetic destiny is referred to several times. The idea of parentage, the idea of a legacy. I wrote several specific examples here, but we've got Hal, we've got Otacon, and his genetic destiny, his parentage, the legacy he's trying to live up to and surpass, because his grandfather worked on the atom bomb, and his father was born the day the bomb went live, and of course does stuff in Metal Gear Solid 5 we're not going to talk about yet. But, he wanted to prove himself better than his destiny, than his family line, to do more than what his previous predecessors had done. And in fact, the fact that he had so thoroughly failed in that is ironically one of the more galvanizing moments of his character arc, and allowing him to actually grow past that and to really do something with himself regardless of his destiny. Speaking of which, let's talk about Naomi. She has her own little obsessions with destiny and genetics, and actually thinking that, DNA is going to is basically like programming for a robot. Now, of course, that's stupid. Forgive me for being blunt, but she really genuinely believed that. You can see that in the way she talks about it, and the way she acts about it. And over the course of the game, she is fundamentally proven wrong about that. But she herself was always trying to figure out her own genetic destiny and try to determine what her legacy was. Unlike Otacon, who already knew his, she wanted to figure out what it was, and it wasn't until by the end of the game that she realized that it didn't matter, and she could do her own thing. We'll see where that goes in future games. Then we have Meryl. Meryl's a minor example, but at the same time, there's no denying that her career path and her journey and her choices are very heavily influenced not just by her father, who is referenced basically off camera, but by her real father, Campbell, Roy, And the idea that she took up the decision and the choices that she made because she knew what her legacy was, because she knew what was expected of her, or at least what she felt was expected of her, and wanted her best to live up to that, and in the end found that she basically couldn't, at least in Metal Gear Solid 1. That character arc kind of does this thing from 1 to 4. We'll talk about that later. But at least in 1, she realizes that this kind of a life is not for her, especially when she sees what it can do to someone, like she sees in Solid, most especially. And then, of course, the obvious one, Snake and the Snakes, Liquid and Solid. Both of them have their own little genetic destiny thing. Liquid, of course, had obsessed over his for years and was constantly trying to surpass it, and at the same time complete it. It's funny because he obviously felt he was chained to his genetics and to his legacy, both sides of the coin. The same thing that Naomi and Otacon here had to deal with. Liquid was dealing with both and trying to prove himself the better and actually accomplish what was always being done in the past. But at the same time, he was also trying to complete it, to show that it was correct, that he was genetically awesome, and he had this awesome legacy, and he was going to live up to both ideals. Again, that whole idea of pushing himself too hard, as I mentioned earlier. And then we have Solid, who's the interesting one, because it's mentioned that he's got his own little, it's coded into your DNA, and he's constantly just ignoring the concept of that and denying it, because the whole time he believes basically in his own self, in his instincts, in his freedom of will. He's an interesting idea, because even when he's confronted full face to his face about his genetic destiny and his legacy, he just rejects it. And I kind of like that, because I think that really defines why Solid is who he is, and why Liquid and Solidus and even Big Boss himself never really accomplished what Solid did, what David did. Because David was fully determined, even within here, even in Metal Gear Solid 1, whom he was, regardless of his past and regardless of where he came from. And that's another one of those big themes in this entire game, the idea of self-destination, predestination, and self-determination. And they do that really good job of that. Let's go ahead and talk about a couple more things here. Two more things, really. We're just going to rush through this one really quick. There's a lot of cynicism about the military-industrial complex. For those of you who weren't around for it, the military-industrial complex used to be basically the new railroad. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, let's just say that the people with the money kind of ran things and kind of summarize it that way. But when the Cold War finally ended, things went in an interesting route. And this game, I'm not going to comment on the real-life aspect of it, but this game definitely takes an incredibly cynical view of things by showing that certain aspects of both the government and the military-industrial complex had become so mired in the way things had been during the Cold War that they lacked the ability to adapt into the present era, and thus were trying to invent new ways to use the old ways. I know that sounds weird, but it's, in other words, rather than reinventing the wheel, they were adding a few spigots to the wheel and trying to keep it rolling down this rocky hill. Hence the development of the Metal Gear and the Rex and all that fun stuff. Speaking of which, though, really quick, they also, especially in a lot of the characters, this is done more later on, but even in Metal Gear Solid 1, a lot of the in-depth personal characterization we get really shows just how bad war is. You know, you hear about war, but granted, this is more common nowadays, but when Metal Gear Solid 1 came out, not many things showed the quieter, more psychologically terrifying aspects of war and how much it can break a person. I've been mentioning this whole time, you know, Wolf, who was the victim, Frank, who was the soldier. Those are actually the two biggest examples. There's a few other examples. You know, Campbell having to lie to his officer, Solid being a constant pawn, Meryl being the innocent who has no idea what she's getting into. It shows all of these people going through something that isn't actually a war, but is warfare in its own right, and we see through them the mirrored reflections of wars of the past, and see just how much it can warp, distort, crush, and otherwise affect someone, and how horrible war is. War is a terrible thing. But what this game shows, and not many things do, is that war doesn't stop being a terrible thing once it's over. I'm reminded very strongly of the Siege of AR-558 and It's Only a Paper Moon from Deep Space Nine, which had that exact same message. War is terrible, and then it's still terrible afterwards. I feel like mentioning as well, this is another good time to bring up the two minds who are not destroyed by war, Revolver Ocelot and Solid Snake. Snake got lucky, but it's arguable that Ocelot did too. I already mentioned the three individuals that contributed to Snake, you know, being able to find himself and to endure war and post-war. But Ocelot's interesting because he has that mind, that amazing mind. Can you tell I like the character? That probably helped him to stay sane, or at the very least, cohesive throughout the many wars he fought over his career. But I say he got lucky too because he also had something to hold on to in order to retain his own sense of self and stability after going through all these horrible things. Big Boss. Think about it. One last thing to talk about. I don't even need my notes for this. I knew I was going to talk about this the moment I picked this game up. One thing that is not obvious in what do you think of when you think of the Metal Gear Solid series? Feel free to put in the comments what you think of. I'd love to hear it. You know, pause the video. What do you think of when you think of the Metal Gear Solid series? Now, I actually asked this question of a few friends of mine, and I'm just going to toss some, you know, bullet points as to what I got. Convoluted plots, Metal Gear, and you know, the repeating, the echo thing that Snake does. Over the top villainy in terms of their presentation and whatnot. Weird dialogue. Stealth gameplay. I'm trying to remember. There was like one other one, but you know, the point is, you tend to think of these sort of things, right? Nanomachines, son! I'm doing the voice wrong. But no, seriously though, nanomachines in general is another thing that was brought up. The funny thing is, when I think of Metal Gear Solid, I think of one thing first and foremost. And I've talked about this before, and I'm going to get a little serious here, because it's nuclear fire, is what I like to call that. For those of you who actually caught my New Vegas lore run when I was towards the end there doing the Lonesome Road, that kind of hit me pretty hard, and I admittedly was being a little more honest in my emotions than I normally would be on my stream because of how badly that hit me. And I talked a little bit about things I don't like talking about. Metal Gear Solid was always intended to be another vehicle for discussing nuclear warfare and how it functions and what nuclear does to a society. Now that's not actually a new thing. Plenty of things that have come out of Japan especially, but across the world, have used the nuclear analogy or the literal nuclear vehicle in order to discuss exactly what happened when we let the genie out of the bottle, when we pulled the pin on the grenade, as I've heard it discussed to us. The idea that is presented very early in the game and is almost forgotten is the one that stuck with me the most. The idea that even though the Cold War had ended, the nuclear threat hadn't gone away. In fact, the nuclear threat had gotten worse because there's so many people now who are experts in the field who don't really have feasible employment like they used to. And there's so much material being produced that could be researched on or experimented on or whatnot in order to try and produce viable nuclear isotopes and whatnot. Now, that's not quite how it works in real life, but that's not the point, because the point the game was making was that the nuclear threat would never actually go away. And this is so hammered in for me. If you pay attention all the way to the end, there's a little quote that talks about the number of nukes that existed. I believe it was like 1993. It gives dates and quotes. And then it talks about the Start 3 and how they started, or was it Start 2? It was Start 2. And how they started, you know, disarming nuclear firepower and nuclear weapons. And then it talked about after that how even after all of that has been done to do that, there was still so much nuclear fire still capable in the world. And that's that most strong point there, and I feel like the actual true point of Metal Gear Solid 1. The rest of the series kind of did its own thing, but I always think of 1 as separate because of that point. Because of that strong message of the fact that the genie has been let out of the bottle, and there's nothing we're ever going to be able to do to actually fix that situation. Not really. And that is horrible and depressing and despairing. And then into that mindset, into the mindset of the possibility of nuclear fire and nuclear war, we introduce Rex. When I first heard about what Rex could do, a stealth nuke, I'm not actually sure I could think of something more horrifying back then. I'm older now, so of course I can think of plenty more horrifying things now. But the point is, at the time, that was one of the most horrifying thoughts I'd ever thought of. Because the whole point that has kept nuclear fire in check for so long is it's very obvious when it's happening, who fired it, where it's going, and we have means to stop it. A stealth nuke, you don't know where it's being fired from, you don't know what it's targeting, you can't track it, and you can't intercept it. It's someone who suddenly has the ability to completely destabilize everything perfectly and hold the entire world at gunpoint. And I couldn't think of anything more horrifying or terrifying than that simple thought. It's actually no wonder that Otacon would spend literally the rest of his life trying to make up for that particular act, and was so relieved when Rex was brought down and all the data destroyed. Well, most of the data destroyed. Because even though the Metal Gears would continue in the future, forgive me for being blunt, I would rather face an entire army of mechanized soldiers than the ability to shoot a nuke perfectly without being caught, without knowing who's hitting it. You know, just imagine at any point in time there would be no warning. Just all of a sudden, a city's gone, or a base, or a chunk of earth. I mean, for God's sakes, a forest. You could target resources, farmland, just gone, no warning. Not at the personal level, Not at the military level, not at the government level. And it's funny considering the way the series went, because I feel like that theme is best described in Metal Gear Solid 2. I'm going to kind of talk about that here, just a little bit. I don't know what I'm going to talk about there, because I'm not there yet. But the idea of the Patriots, the AIs, the network, deciding to create this artificial war economy, and we're getting into war territory here, as a solution to the nuclear problem. Make war, traditional, ground-based war, an economy, a business, in order to prevent the possibility of nuclear engagement. I could be reading too much into that, but if you think about it in its own horrible, coldly calculating way, that actually makes a lot of sense. And which would you rather have, the war economy or a nuclear fire? I guess we'll find out when we get to our next game, won't we? Which will be next week, hopefully. No promises. I'm really pushing through these. Hope you enjoyed. Hope I had something to share that was worth listening to. I'll see you next time.
Ah!